I don't know if you've heard of the 7 generations thinking, but the idea is that when you make decisions, when you think about the actions that you're going to undertake, you think, how will these affect my relatives 7 generations in the future? And you act accordingly. And so for these kids to be able to see natives living big, wonderful, fulfilling lives shows them that it's possible. You can believe it's possible, but when you see it, it hits differently. And so representation matters in that sense. But it really, I don't want to sound too dramatic with this, but it is a life and death issue.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Jessica Engelking as we take a communication perspective on better representation for Indigenous voices. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Jessica Engelking. Jessica is a descendant of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe. She is the representation director for the Great Plains Action Society, among many other things. This is the 4th episode in our Unheard Stories series, and this is kind of a follow-up to a conversation we had earlier this year with Sakowis Nobis, and that conversation was on the work of the Great Plains Action Society for re-indigenizing, rematriating, and decolonizing. I think this conversation with Jessica fits so clearly into this theme of unheard stories and exemplifies why there is a need for a role like Jessica's as representation director and a need for a concentrated effort on representation. And what I really like that we get into with Jessica today is that we don't want to stop at just saying that representation matters, but we have to look at the kind of representation. We need to understand that good representation matters. And a lot of times that means we have to look at who is telling the story and why. So let's continue the conversation with Jessica. Hi, Jessica. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Abbie.
I'm really looking forward to getting to talk to you as a next turn after the conversation that I had with Sakowis, who you work closely with. Yes, it was funny how that conversation turned out to be just one big overview of the work that you all do at the Great Plains Action Society, which is not really what I was planning on for that conversation, but just with how it ended up, it turns out you all do so much work. And we just wanted to try to touch on all of it a little bit. So it's great that we can go more in depth today with you. So knowing that that's the context, let's kind of start there. And can you take a moment to introduce yourself? And then you could start talking about the work that you specifically do as the representation director for the Great Plains Action Society.
My name is Jessica Engelking. I'm the representation director for Great Plains Action Society. It's not a title I've encountered elsewhere. It's something that is really Sakowis' brainchild to capture all the work that falls under the umbrella of talking about how we are represented by the world, how we represent ourselves to the world, and the places and spaces in which we are lacking representation, and why representation matters. I'm from northern Minnesota. I'm White Earth Ojibwe. I am not enrolled. White Earth uses blood quantum at the moment, and I am 1/32nd short of the requirement.
Wow.
But my mom is enrolled. My grandma was born on White Earth, but I did not grow up with my Native community. I did my undergraduate at the University of Minnesota Morris. I was able to take advantage of their Native tuition waiver program. Morris was originally a boarding school, and part of it becoming a University of Minnesota was that Native students would have their tuition waived when they went there. So I was very fortunate to be able to go there. And then I came to the University of Iowa to pursue an advanced degree in philosophy. Both my undergrad and master's degree are in philosophy. And towards the end of that, I'd originally thought I'd wanted to go into academia, but I kind of became a bit disillusioned, realizing that, the academy wasn't really as much of a place of learning as it was, kind of a giant real estate scam. And I think we're seeing that now more with the ongoing campus protests, pushing for divestment from, arms manufacturers, which,
Yeah.
really shouldn't be the goal of universities, I don't think. But yeah, after I realized I wasn't going to be doing that, I kind of floundered around for a bit, worked service industry positions for a while. And then I started working in the Native community in Minneapolis right about the same time as Standing Rock. I remember my first trip out there with Secaucus. I was working at a Native American elementary school and working as a reading coach. And so I wasn't out at Standing Rock as much as, I would have liked, but I think being in the community was really important and really fulfilling at the time. And then when that position ended due to budget cuts, funding, I ended up linking up with Secaucus, who I've known since my graduate school days in Iowa City. They've been a great friend. And, she had started this organization, which was originally, I think, Indigenous Iowa, but expanded to kind of move away from the colonial borders and more accurately represent the geographical area that we are operating in. And I really got to come on and try to use the skills that I gained in all my years studying academic philosophy to explain and address issues for Native people in ways that really there's not a lot of opportunity to do outside of the university setting. And so I get to do the writing that I want to do and the research that I want to do, and it's an absolute dream job. But some of the more concrete issues that I address are things like in Iowa, we're dealing with mascots. So the representation and appropriation of Native imagery is a big issue. It's something that harms Native children, but all children in general. And then stuff like representation within the political sphere, which we're lacking in, not just, not that many Native politicians, but also, active voter suppression to keep Indigenous voices from being heard. And then, anything that can broadly be construed as dealing with representation. I know Secaucus talked about our 3 initiatives: the land defense, the protecting the sacred, and representation. They're all interconnected and really dealing, at the core with addressing the harms of the settler colonial violence that we're still enduring. But so, I guess anything that doesn't obviously fall under land defense or protecting the sacred, I do. It's great. It's given me a lot of space to do a lot of different work. More recently, it's been working with issues surrounding education. So on the younger level, talking about the whitewashing of the historical narrative with students so that they know the truth, because the truth does matter. And then in higher education, having the opportunity to go in and talk to college students who are looking to become educators and to talk about the issues that Native students are facing in the classroom.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And I know that there's just so much involved in what you do. Like you said, it's expansive and it's interconnected, and that makes sense to me. You've made me think so many things already, but the piece that I think I want to start with is, you use the phrase, I've heard it before, of representation matters. And that is something that I just, feel so deeply to be true. But I'm curious if you could elaborate on that as far as maybe your own personal experience of, well, why, to kind of dig a little deeper and say, why does it matter? Because, it's not just storytelling for the sake of storytelling, but that representation, like you're saying, is really the root of all this other change that can happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 40. I didn't get a chance to grow up with the representation that we do now, and while there's not a lot, it's absolutely wonderful to see Native actors in shows, in the arts, in the sports, doing all these things, and that matters because the youth, the youth are so important. Not to pan-indigenize, but in most Native cultures, youth are everything. They're why we do what we do. I don't know if you've heard of the 7 generations thinking, but the idea is that when you make decisions, when you think about the actions that you're going to undertake, you think, how will these affect my relatives 7 generations in the future? And you act accordingly. And so for these kids to be able to see natives living big, wonderful, fulfilling lives shows them that it's possible. You can believe it's possible, but when you see it, it hits differently. And so representation matters in that sense. But it really, I don't want to sound too dramatic with this, but it is a life and death issue.
I don't think that's dramatic. I think that's real.
Yeah, no, dehumanization is an aspect of representation. And when we allow for dehumanization, it creates these situations that allow genocide level violence. If we look at what's going on right now in the world, settler colonial violence isn't unique to the United States. And so when we look at the news and we see the way that the genocide against our Palestinian relatives is being portrayed, you can see the dehumanizing language in the way that, these babies aren't treated like babies. They're enemies. They're expendable. And when we dehumanize humans to the point that they're expendable, then death occurs. And in the United States too, dehumanization leads to violence against women. So like the sexualization of women, Indigenous women are 10 times as likely to be murdered as non-natives. If we're shown as murderable, we're going to get murdered. And for our children, things like mascots are harmful to their self-image and their self-esteem. And Native kids already have suicide rates 4 times higher than non-natives. Suicide's the second leading cause of death for Native youth. And so it's vitally important that they see themselves as worthy, that they see themselves as valuable, as necessary, as loved, as full humans. So yeah, representation is so important to the safety and well-being of our Indigenous relatives. It's more than just, seeing all the possibilities that you can be at a more basic level. It's establishing humanity.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me because I do think of stories as being so connected to imagination. Like you're saying right there, that the more stories we hear, the greater our imagination can be for what we believe is possible for ourselves applied to anybody. And I think especially if, I'm thinking about the kind of dominant story, that's something that Sakawas and I really talked about, is this Christian colonial capitalist story, one version of the story that has been sold as the story and has dominated. And that 7 generations thinking is really meaningful, I think, because even if you look back retroactively and think about, okay, well, 7 generations ago, what were the stories being told? And they were Christian colonial capitalist stories that still permeate. And so that is why we live in the social world that we do. And so I see, the work of representation of sharing more widely these stories that haven't been told because they have not been the dominant narrative means that the imagination expands and means that, maybe you don't see it tomorrow even, but the next generation and the next generation and 7 generations from now, kind of a parallel. If we think about the old stories that have been told for so long and how they shape how we act now, what are the new stories we can be telling to shape the future is kind of how I see the work that you do. So I don't know how you think about that role of storytelling within representation in your work.
So Native stories in the media, in literature, are important for establishing and building empathy and for just showing life as it is in a way that isn't and hasn't been shown much. If you think about shows like Reservation Dogs or Rutherford Falls, here we have shows that feature contemporary Native Americans, living just normal lives. And it matters that we're able to tell these stories, but also that people see that, Natives exist. I know Sakawas mentioned this, but like the huge percentage of America that doesn't even realize that Indigenous people are still here,
Yeah, right.
still living. And, when I talk about my work, that's something where I'm like, it's wild because I kind of have to start at the very beginning. Like,
yeah.
We exist and then go from there. But yeah, it's important to see these stories. And then So there's storytelling in the fictional sense, but then there's also like telling the true historical.
Yeah.
These are the events that happened. These
Mhm.
are the lives that were lived. These things occurred. And that's so important for understanding the context that we exist in now. In Iowa, there's a lot of pushback against what they're calling critical race theory in schools, which, it isn't. No one's teaching critical race theory outside of the basically law school level. So no, elementary or middle school
Yeah.
students were being taught critical race theory. But what they were talking about is a historical narrative that challenges
Mhm.
the dominant narrative of, American supremacy and, the idea that, America came here and liberty and the land wasn't being used and they, conquered the natives and none of it's really true.
Mhm.
Settlers arrived on a continent that was occupied with land that was stewarded using centuries old traditional knowledge, and they engaged in war and treaties were signed and treaties were broken. And all of that matters to understanding, where we are right now in history. And a lot of American history is ugly. It's dark. It's disturbing. But it happened, and ignoring it, won't help us address, what caused it and what's come after it. And if we're going to make any progress, we need to honestly understand where we are. And we can't do that as long as we're telling, fake stories that make us sound good.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you bring that up, that fiction piece that, yeah, storytelling is not just the, once upon a time and fairy tales and, just fiction, which, like you said, can be meaningful too, but also the storytelling of our lives, of our communicating, of being in relationship with each other. Like, to me, it's all stories. And so if you do have representation, if you have Indigenous people in positions of power, then that's telling Indigenous youth a story about themselves and what's possible for them that wouldn't maybe be told otherwise, or not in the same way.
Yes.
I'm curious to go back a little bit to your background and your introduction of yourself. How does your background in philosophy shape the way that you approach this work? Do you see it kind of come out in the work that you do?
Yes. So there are a lot of issues, representation being one of them. And within representation, dealing, with a lot of tricky conceptual stuff. Understanding representation, is a complex conceptual issue to grasp. And questions around identity are a very big part of the Indigenous experience, unfortunately, having to deal with, being not native enough, not the right kind of native, all sorts of struggles of trying to figure out who you are in a world that has made it exceedingly complicated for you to exist. And so, yeah, I really have the space to kind of sit and tackle these conceptual issues in a way that most people just don't have, the time or resources to do. And stuff's complicated. I mean, trying to understand, the difference between like why pretending to be Indian isn't okay, but our two-spirit relatives are valued and valid and they exist and their identities are real. Gender and race are are both, these abstract social concepts, and really picking apart the conceptual parts and then understanding the reality part that goes into it creates for a full picture and a more complete understanding. And I think the understanding the actual part and not just the abstract part is important. And that's also going back to why understanding, these stories, the true narrative is so important, because when we look at issues surrounding, gender or race or whatever, they exist within a context. And that context, is a very, very real historical context that was shaped largely, like we said, by Christian settler colonialism, white supremacist at that. So the actuality of the white supremacy matters when understanding stuff. You often, hear people talk about like reverse racism or, well, if you flip the races around, this would be blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, no, we can't do that. And we can't do that because that's not the way the actual world is. People, I think, want to sometimes abstract away from reality to get their thoughts to align with what they want them to be. So it's important to be able to really sit with and examine these different issues. And I do use my background as much as I can. It gets frustrating. So I did teach logic for a few years at the university level, and you'd think it would be really helpful with dismantling all the bad arguments, but but they've been dismantled, so many times, and people just don't want to let them go. So it's frustrating, but just have to keep plugging away at it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, a lot of what you're saying is resonating to me or sounding familiar in a way because, my background and what my podcast is rooted in is this communication perspective that is built around this social constructionist idea, which is that, our meaning is created through the stories that we tell. It's not innate. And so that's such a helpful lens for me and makes so much sense to me to apply to what we're talking about today around representation, around history and the stories that have been told. Like you're saying, so many people in a number of places in the United States are fighting so vehemently against critical race theory and, these ideas that they have, these not news stories, excuse me, like the real stories, like you said, that people are trying to get told because they are the real stories. And like you're saying, people are so attached to seeing themselves, seeing their country, seeing history as this one thing. And to me, the way to speak into that is to say, well, that's one version of one meaning that has been made. It is not the truth. It is not history, capital H, history, the thing that happened, because it's just one perspective and just one meaning that's been made and very twisted to serve certain people's purposes. And so if you can expand your perspective and say, well, let's look at the other meaning that's been made. What do the stories mean through other people's eyes who experience them, and what's the truth in that? And then I guess, getting back to that point that have some empathy that's like uncomfortable for people, but that's where I'd want to encourage people not to, back away because of the discomfort, but to try to lean in, because when you can kind of be in that tension between some of the stories that are true about our country and the way people have acted, then you're complexifying the story, you're understanding a fuller truth, even if it's uncomfortable for white people to engage with.
Yeah, and the discomfort is real, and it's posing a real threat to, the dominant powers, especially now with technology that allows so many people to get their stories out, to be heard. If you think about the efforts to ban TikTok, right? That in a large way has to do with wanting to prevent these stories from getting out, to stop people from seeing what's happening, to stop people from seeing, the violence that we're enacting in real time that threatens the narrative, right? That we're the good guy. But when you see, tens of thousands of people talking, about the bombs that we're paying for, destroying their homes, their families, their cities, all the universities. When we can see that, it becomes, harder to deny.
Yeah, it's making me think that the name of my podcast being Stories Lived, Stories Told is a reference to this communication perspective and this understanding of kind of these two ends of the spectrum, that there's the stories we live and the stories we tell. And then in between, though, there are all these other stories, these untold stories and stories we're not hearing and stories we're not digesting or not knowing. And what happens in between the stories we live and the stories we tell is that meaning making. that we're applying. And we have to be conscious about that. And that, kind of brings us to that, like, well, what are the told stories and what are the untold stories? And that seems to me to be like one way of understanding the work that you do, is that you're saying, okay, here's this great big old pile of untold stories. How do we tell them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's kind of a constant advocating for the truth, because the efforts to whitewash are constant.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you tell me more specifically about some specific stories of what are these kind of new stories? And not new, but new to people who haven't heard them before, these new truths that you are hoping to tell more people in the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, so a good example of some of the work Great Plains does is our Truthsgiving event. So I think like one of the first narratives that children encounter, and I'm not certain what the state of, the Pilgrims and Indian narrative is in education right now. It's been a while since I was in elementary school, and I'm sure it varies from place to place. But, one of the first stories that children were taught about natives was the myth of Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims and the Indians, and, here's a good welcome fall feast, and everyone ate and was happy, and we know that wasn't true, and that was, a lot of murder. There's a lot more murdering
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
story that we were told. But so we've kind of used that as a jumping off point for our Truthsgiving event to talk about not just the true story of, early contact, but the fact that our history is largely fabricated. And while doing so, to celebrate what's currently going on, we have a band come in, and Indigenous artists, and just celebrating, that we're here, that we're thriving, that we're doing the best we can, and pushing back against, these stories that are kind of at the heart of the American experience.
Yeah, Thanksgiving, that's such a great example that it feels maybe like tangible for people who this is maybe a new conversation for, of that white Americans are very attached to that story and narrative. And it feels threatening to say, it wasn't all sunshine and smiles and friendship here. There's a much darker truth to this story. And we have to look at that and be honest about that. And so, that's that moment of discomfort maybe comes up for people that you have to lean into instead of running away from. I'm curious, thinking about the representation work that you do, and that, this is something you've been involved with for so many years. What has your experience been? What have you seen as a result of all the work that you've already done, maybe for Indigenous people, but also non-Indigenous people? What is the representation doing out in the world that you've been able to see the impacts of so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely been a shift towards teaching the whole truth. There are definite changes and definite improvements. I don't know if I really want to say that, it's, because of the work that we've been doing
Sure.
in society, but it's, we're part of a cultural movement to create a better, safer world for our children, and to create a more just society. It's necessary that we understand what is actually going on. And so, I guess I don't really know how to word it.
No, that's totally fair. And I don't mean to ask you to speak to this, larger thing, but maybe a more specific question I could ask, where you can at least, speak to your own personal experience, is, have you, in the years of doing this work, encountered people who, have you had any kinds of conversations where people are saying, it means so much to me that this, or this is what it means to me that you do this work? Have you, without asking you to speak broadly of what this is doing, have you had individual interactions where you've been able to see the impact in some specific ways?
Yeah. So I think actually one of the most rewarding things was last fall at our first Indigenous Peoples Day in Iowa City. We got to meet some professors at the university in the education department. And it turns out that they actually use our work quite a bit
Wow.
in their program. and that was just beyond rewarding to see that, our work means so much to these professors that they're teaching it to their students. I'm trying to think more representation specific,
Mhm.
you know.
But that's a cool example too, because that feels like you are this central pinpoint, and then there's just like endless ripples out from that
Mhm.
because you've done this work, and then someone else can teach that work to a classroom full of students who's going to go out and teach that on and on and on, which, like you said, you can't truly know or measure the effects of that, but it's good to know that that's out there in the world and that started with the work that you're doing.
I will say, like, on a personal level, so I wrote a book. I was part of a middle grade book series by the Minnesota Humanities Center about Native lives. And I had the honor of writing a biography of Minnesota's Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, who is a White Earth Ojibwe. And there was an event where some students read sections of the books that were part of the series. And to see a student, read my book a little bit and talk about how much it meant to them to see someone like them represented in a book, that was really powerful.
Yeah.
So it wasn't specifically Great Plains, but
No, hey, still definitely falls under the representation category. Yeah, that I think that's definitely very relevant. Would you want to speak to that a little more? Tell us more about maybe even what it meant to you to write that book.
Yeah, I guess I never really saw myself, writing a kid's book, but I responded to an email call for submissions for a book series about famous Minnesota natives. I submitted a suggestion, one of the suggestions being, Peggy Flanagan, who is such a great role model and, one of the few Indigenous women in high up government positions. A lieutenant governor, she's the highest ranking native in Minnesota. And so, yeah, it was really an honor to get to work on that. It's very weird writing a biography about someone who's still alive.
Yeah, I bet.
That's kind of a trip. But yeah, to be able to put that out there and to be a part of a series that's growing, actually. There were 3 books originally. Mine was one of the original 3, and then I think they're adding 6 more books to the
Wow.
series. So it's going to be pretty special.
To me, that's definitely part of this larger conversation around representation, because I think like we can talk about it really broadly and go, what are the stories we're telling in school? What's the story that's being told culturally? What's going on at a policy level? But also all of these systems are made up of individual people. And so what does it look like? It's interesting to me to ask, what does it look like in each individual's life? Like, what does the representation mean to people? And it's taking me back to the beginning, widening the understanding for what's possible to me is kind of like the purpose or function of the representation. Yeah. What else do you want to say about representation? What's at the heart of it to you? What matters about it to you? What haven't we covered today that you'd like to speak to? And if that is too broad of a question, I can ask something more specific.
Can you ask something more specific while I think about the broader one?
Yeah. In what ways have you seen representation, which can kind of feel like a big abstract theme? In what ways have you seen that spark change that feels really tangible in the world? In whatever ways you have, but maybe specifically as it relates to the other initiatives of the Great Plains Action Society.
So, in a positive aspect, representation can spark inspiration, can inspire hope. So this past movie award season, when Lily Gladstone was being awarded and nominated in ways in which Indigenous people, especially women or femme or non-binary people haven't been represented in the past. There were a lot of pictures and images of the children looking at the TV and seeing Lily. And that, I think, is the best visualization of
Yeah.
how positive representation matters to have these kids be able to see themselves as being anything they want to be, including an Oscar nominated
Yeah.
actress. The flip side, the negative representation really fits in with the rest of Great Plains' work in the dehumanization that allows for these other problems to continue to exist. I'm trying to think of like a specific example. And okay, so for instance, the absence and erasure of traditional knowledge. In doing so, so much ecological harm has been inflicted on our planet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Indigenous people have been stewards of their land since time immemorial in many cases. And they have this traditional knowledge that was suppressed and ignored, and disaster resulted. So for millennia, Indigenous people have participated in controlled burns for forest safety. And so, when that was stopped, we ended up with the whole state of California on fire. And there's a growing movement to embrace this traditional knowledge because it's true and it works and it's effective. And so absence of Indigenous representation in spaces, that are in charge of land stewardship results in ecological catastrophe. In that sense, our absence of representation in spaces where decisions are made creates problems that we have to actively be defending the land against.
Yeah, that's a great point for kind of going beyond this like representation for representation's sake, which is still important, I think, for the storytelling and, what that means to people personally, but also that it is truly so interconnected in all these other areas of life in the world, in these spaces where Indigenous stories, truths, knowledge has been repressed and not shared, that, all you can kind of make this web of connections to a lack of Indigenous representation of all of these other things that are going on in the world. Like you say, California being on fire, or just this way of, I don't even know what to call it, because it's not stewarding the land is not what goes on, I would say, in most of United States farming or, any of it.
Yeah, like you said, it's not representation for representation's sake. There's also very real issues of power.
Yeah.
When Indigenous people aren't in positions and spaces where decisions are being made, then Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values aren't given a voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that feels like an important lens too, to really see stories as power and to try to understand how it's been wielded and who it's benefited and who it's hurt historically. And kind of asking that question, this one of the practices that's really important in taking a communication perspective is this reflection and also looking forward. And so there's these questions that we want to ask ourselves, especially as we see ourselves as, active participants. We talk about social construction, that we are the active participants in creating our social worlds. And so if we can look back and say, okay, how did we get where we are? What are the patterns? What are the stories that we're told? What happened? What got made? And then look where you are and say, what are you making now? And then look forward and say, well, what do we want to be making? I think those are three great questions to kind of revisit. Like we've been talking about the old stories and the way that try to understand the way that those have shaped us. And then also what are those stories we need to lift up that have not been, that could help us create a better social world and empower us to do so, because it's power.
Yes, it is power.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, as we wrap up, I'll just throw out one more question I want to ask. And again, if there's, not an easy answer off the top of your head, no worries. But I'm thinking about something I believe to be true about stories, that is like the inclusion begets more inclusion, and lifting up and humanizing one group helps lift up and humanize everybody, this kind of power with, not power over. And this, really seeing the shared humanity and being on each other's team instead of like a us versus them thing. Kind of returning again, even to your philosophy background, I wonder what your kind of philosophy is on the importance of representation and lifting up diverse voices as a whole for our culture, maybe kind of finishing our conversation by taking a step even beyond or zooming out on what you do and seeing it as part of a larger context of lifting up more and more and more stories to create more and more and more imaginations of what's possible and better social worlds as a result.
Yeah, I think, the more that we hear and encounter and have access to these stories, the more we can engage with them, the more we can empathize, the more we can see ourselves in them, and the more we can see the people who are telling these stories as full humans,
Mm-hmm.
as something to be cherished in the way that human life should be cherished. And the more stories that we hear, the more people we come to recognize as our relatives.
Yeah, yeah.
And when we see, other people as our relatives, we're less likely to want to, steal their land or drop bombs on their house.
Yeah. Yeah. Those feel like really, really real things. And I like that you're bringing us back to, not just focusing on the story, but the storyteller behind the story too, and who's the human behind the story.
Yeah. And who gets to tell the story, and especially looking at the voices that are being suppressed, because those are often the stories that we need to hear the most, because those are the stories that might make us a little uncomfortable, but that we need to hear.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky because, representation is so broad. On the one hand, it's great to see, Indigenous players get drafted in the WNBA and, have these role models for the kids to look up to. And that's one form of representation. But then, we have like hypersexualized Indigenous women Halloween costumes.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we also have high schools that is something that I was kind of, I've been thinking about, with it being graduation. There have been cases of Indigenous students having their beaded hats with their eagle feathers be taken from them. And that's not okay. But at the same time, you have schools with Native mascots dressing up as Natives. And, where it's okay to play Indian, but not okay to be Indian. And that is a really complicated problem, and one honestly we shouldn't still have to be dealing with in 2024. But here we are, just right now we have this going on where schools are cutting the hair of our Native children.
What I'm taking away from what you're saying is that the work is far from over, which is also maybe one of those hard truths to accept.
Yeah, I know. So when you talked about rematriation with Sakowis, I remember her mentioning, this isn't something that we're going to see in our lifetime.
Yeah.
Hopefully with representation being, more of an abstract social thing, that change can occur faster. I am hopeful that we will see a lot of changes in my lifetime. I am worried about the pushback. Even here in Iowa, as we've been fighting to get rid of racist mascots at some of the school, we're met with a ton of resistance from people who have had being an Indian, it's not an Indian, but whatever their mascot is, become such a part of their identity. They're not willing to let it go, even though it's hurting Native children. It's hurting their children. And this is something that we've known for a while. So decades of research, and pretty much every professional organization, the American Medical Association, Psychological Association, have all come out and said mascots are harmful. It's really not up for debate. The harm has been established. And it's frustrating because even with that, people don't care.
Yeah, right.
We're not giving up those fights, especially the battles that affect our children. We're going to continue to do whatever we can to make the safest and healthiest environments for the children.
Yeah. Well, glad to know that there are people like you and Sakawas and everyone at the Great Plains Action Society out there that it is doing this work, and that you can bring the perspective that you have and be dedicated to it, because there are people who are dedicated to the pushback like you were getting at. And so it matters that there's people like you dedicated to pushing back the pushback. I don't know a better way to say that. But Jessica, I'm really, really appreciative of your time today and getting to hear your perspective. Is there any last thing you want to leave us with before we wrap up?
No, I just encourage people to check out our work at greatplainsaction.org. Listen to the episode with Sakawas, because they do a great job explaining the wide variety of work that we do.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Jessica. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on. These act as next turns, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the 2 questions I would have you think about are: what examples of Indigenous representation have you encountered? And for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, how can you seek out more stories told by Indigenous people about Indigenous experiences? You can reach out to me to share your reflections, as well as any of your own questions or ideas. And you can do that through email, the website, by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or by engaging on the CMM Institute Substack. Links to all those places are in the show notes for easy access. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, share an episode, this episode or any, with a friend that you would like to invite into the conversation. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward better social worlds. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.